Yep.
Last year in your budget request, you asked for $114.7 million for diversity and inclusion activities. This year, you asked for $27 million more. Does that mean that what you did last year didn't work, and that's why you need $27 million more? And how much is it going to take if you're already failing at your objectives with DEI? How much more are you going to need to succeed at it?
I just highlight, sir, that as you know, we are directed by Congress as a result of the 2020.
Gentleman's time has expired. I want to inform the witnesses and the members that to make sure everybody knows I'm being fair, I have been allowing members of the panel to finish their answers at the 5-minute point. I'm going to cease to do that. 5 minutes is 5 minutes to make sure that people understand that we treat everybody the same, no matter which side of the aisle they sit on. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you. Secretary Austin, you were just asked a question with respect to Afghanistan, and you were not given the opportunity to complete your answer. If you would like to, I'd like to give you that opportunity to complete your answer right now. Is there anything else you'd like to say on the subject, sir?
Only to say that I remain very proud of the tremendous work and the sacrifices that our troops made and throughout our efforts in Afghanistan, but especially at the end as they worked hard to evacuate over 124,000 people from there. And work continues to ensure that the people that have helped us in Afghanistan, and if they want to repatriate to the United States or someplace else, we can help them. So.
As someone who served in Afghanistan, I appreciate your remarks, sir. Chairman Milley, with respect to Bakhmut, which you mentioned earlier, it appears that Russia is still unable to accomplish core strategic objectives. It is frankly remarkable to me that Bakhmut still stands and is still owned by the Ukrainians. Do you share the perspective that the failure of Russia after going all out to capture this town is indicative of the fact that we're still facing, that the Ukrainians rather are still facing the same deeply incompetent military that they were facing last year? Or is this a special brand of incompetence that we're seeing with respect to this particular military effort?
I think the Russians are struggling in a big way with command and control, logistics, sustainment, basic tactical doctrine, but also training. These forces are very undertrained. They're essentially doing frontal assaults into machine gun positions, et cetera, and they're getting slaughtered. The Russian troops are. The Ukrainians are doing a very effective area defense that is proven to be very costly to the Russians. For about the last 20, 21 days, the Russians have not made any progress whatsoever in and around Bakhmut. So it's a slaughter fest for the Russians. They're getting hammered in the vicinity of Bakhmut, and the Ukrainians have fought very, very well. That's also true across the entire frontline trace, from Crimea all the way down to Kherson. The Ukrainians have fought a remarkable defensive fight, and the Russians have not achieved their strategic objectives.
Do you see the Russian objectives with respect to Bakhmut as being part of their offensive, or would you say this is a special effort and the broader offensive has yet to begin?
No, I think it's the latter. I think I think the Russian offensive, if you will, began some time ago, and it has had fits and starts, and it has not achieved the momentum and success that they expected it to achieve.
If I could ask you a broader question, which you may not be able to answer. If we had never supported the Ukrainians at all, would Russia have conquered Ukraine by now?
I think without Western support, first of all, I think the Ukrainian people, their will is indomitable. These are the same people, they're the sons and grandsons of the folks who fought Stalin and Zhukov for 10 years from 1945 to 1955. So the Ukrainians are not going to be easily conquered no matter what. If they're fighting with pitchforks and spears, they're going to fight back. But having said that, they would have probably lost considerably more ground without Western assistance. There's no question in my mind about that. So I think Western assistance has been critical to the Ukrainians being able to defend themselves.
With respect to Putin, seems to me, seems to a lot of folks, very clear that he's a war criminal, lots of evidence for this, and yet there are plenty of people in this country who still don't see it that way, who see Putin as basically a national leader pursuing national interests. If you could speak to those folks and give us your sense on his status as a war criminal, that would be appreciated.
I think the war itself is illegal. It undermines one of the first principles that were established after World War II, that underwrites the so-called rules-based international order that is part of the United Nations, for example, which is wars of aggression, which are unprovoked, not in the cause of defense, where large countries then use their military force to attack smaller countries not in the defense of their own nation. And Ukraine presented no military threat whatsoever to Russia, and yet he lined up 170, 100, or 200,000 troops, multiple divisions, multiple acts of advance, and he conducted a major league war of aggression. A war of aggression in and of itself is a war crime. And then, of course, you've got the actual war crimes in many of the cities and towns. When you bomb and shell civilian cities, when you bomb and shell civilian infrastructure, when you're killing kids and women and children, all of that is war crimes, and their units, their unit commanders, all the way up the chain are committing war crimes. The Russian forces are. And it's a tragic unfolding of events, but it's true. There's a lot of war crimes being committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, Secretary Alston, also want to thank you for coming before this committee. Before I begin my questions today, I want to make a comment regarding the President's budget. You were sitting here today to ask for our support and say you'll make do with what you have, and that's your job. But what I want to be clear about is I'm going to do everything I can to get you more. Because as you well know, the threats facing the United States are greater than ever. A 1.2 or 2.3% increase is not enough. We've got to see real growth over inflation. While there are cuts that we should be looking at, national security is not one of them. Secretary Alston, General Milley, neither of you need a reminder of the vast impact Huntsville, Alabama has on the defense industrial base. We were listed as one of the best places to live in the United States by U.S. News and World Report, the highest concentration of engineers per capita, and the nation's only public high school solely dedicated to cyber and engineering. Combined all of this with over 45,000 civilian and military personnel at Redstone Arsenal, which houses several major departments of defense equities, plus the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. And based on what is best for national security, we're looking forward to a near-term decision for Air Force for the base U.S. Space Command headquarters. Right now, Huntsville has 25% of the nation's top defense contractors, the best and brightest of our small and medium mid-sized businesses. One DoD agency at Redstone is the DIA's Missile and Space Intelligence Agency, also known as MISIC. We've seen reports that MISIC is receiving some unexpected and valuable Russian weapons from the battlefield in Ukraine. President Biden said last week that while China hasn't provided Russian weapons yet, it doesn't mean they won't. Secretary Alston, can you speak to the value of MISIC bringing to the joint forces and the importance of the intelligence they are gathering should the U.S. find itself in further conflict?
They bring a lot of value. Obviously, our ability to learn more about what our adversaries are using and how they're using it is critical to us being successful in the future.
Thank you. General Milley, when you took over as the Army's Chief of Staff back in 2015, the modernization plan you inherited was, well, let's just say it's not the most robust as people would like. Almost 8 years later, we have Army Futures Command and the 6 key modernization priorities. Hypersonics is one of the highest priority modernization areas of the Defense Department, and is pursuing and falls under the Army's top priority, long-range precision fires. It also happens to be one of Huntsville's many areas of expertise. I know you've been able to see it all yourself several times. What do you believe the services have done well when it comes to hypersonic weapons and target development?
As the Secretary said, I think a little bit earlier, we had 12 successful hypersonic weapons tests. And hypersonics, it's not a magic weapon. There are no magic weapons in warfare. But it has a significant capability, and it travels at such speeds that there's no known defense right now. And depending on the level of warhead, it can do a lot of damage. So the development of hypersonics for us, and was asked earlier by one of the previous congressmen, I'm not going to opine whether it's strategically stable or unstable. All I want to do is make sure that we get there firstest with the mostest, and I don't want the enemy to have a whole bunch of hypersonics and us not. So I think it's important that we have that, and I think it's a significant capability. Long-range precision fires is the #1 Army priority. and all of the services are working on long-range precision fires. And the Futures Command and the initiatives that went into what the Army did have led to, in the last 36 months, 40 months or so, the most successful set of Army modernization programs in the last 4 decades. And that's because of that command, the innovation that the troops are putting into it, the commanders that have done that. Obviously, Huntsville's part of that. There's a whole series of those that spread throughout different locations. There's 6 of those priorities that are the top 6. But they're carrying the way forward for the Army, and the Army's in pretty good shape going forward.
Thank you, General.
Hypersonics are critical.
Based on your best military recommendation, are we moving fast enough to be able to field this technology in a near-term conflict?
I would argue that we're never moving fast enough. I'd always want to move faster, but you have to move faster within the bounds of, first of all, physics with some of these things and the testing regimes that are applied, but also the money. You can't have everything all the time.
Thank you,
So
General
it's
Milley.
balance.
Secretary Austin, I yield my time back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Strickland, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. This is for Secretary Austin. I continue to be concerned about housing costs for service members and their families. And serving Joint Base Lewis McChord, which is in the metropolitan Seattle-Tacoma area, it's one of the fastest growing regions in the entire United States, and housing is at a premium. The department currently gives service members 95% of their calculated housing allowance. Last year, I was pleased to introduce the Basic Allowance for Housing Restoration Act, which will ensure that service members receive their full BAH. I'm encouraged by your recent memo to strengthen our support to service members and their families. As you know, they have to have their basic needs met at a minimum because this is directly tied to readiness. So can you please discuss your current thinking on how we fully restore BAH to 100% and your work to support service members and their families?
Oh, well, thank you. And
Closer to you so I can see.
yeah, I've heard you. I've heard our troops, our families, and I know this is important. And this is a thing I've asked for. The panel that will do the review of military compensation to look further into to see what's in the realm of the possible. But I know that this is a concern, and I would say that we'll do everything we can to make sure that we're taking additional stress off our families and off our troops.
Great, thank you very much. And I have one more question to talk about the role of diversity and inclusion in readiness. So I grew up as an Army brat. My father joined an Army that was segregated. And when President Truman desegregated the troops in 1946, that was controversial at the time. People met it with a lot of skepticism. And given some of the language that I've heard around this conversation in the military, some people would call that woke. But we also know that there was a very strategic and specific reason that President Truman did that. So can you talk specifically about how DEI is good for the military, recognizing that 40% of those who are enlisted are people of color, but making sure that we are doing what we can to help them with promotion, with military justice, and to make sure that they are treated fairly, just like my father wanted to be?
We remain grateful for your father's service. We are a diverse nation. Our military should look like the nation that it defends, and it does. And I think, I truly believe that diversity makes us stronger. It brings different cultures, different ideas together, and we set a great example for the world wherever we go. As you know, Congress, with the 2020 NDA, directed the Secretary of Defense to develop a strategic diversity and inclusion plan. And that was done in 2020. We're following that plan. And again, as we follow that plan, we allocate resources to make sure that we're doing the right thing. In terms of promotions, we promote best qualified. The question is always whether or not we have the processes and procedures in place to ensure that we have a competitive space remains just that, competitive. If you have the talents, if you're willing to work, then you will achieve your goal, and you should understand what that pathway is to success as well. So we not only have to provide opportunity, but leaders should be mentoring and coaching along the way. So.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary Austin. And for me, when I talk about diversity and inclusion in promotion opportunity, it goes without saying that the people who are seeking those promotions are in fact qualified. Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Austin, my constituents, and I know millions of other Americans remain extremely concerned about the politicization of the Department of Defense. We've talked about this before. The policies that you've implemented have led to what we believe is the worst recruiting crisis in the history of the DoD, become a distraction to our service members when they should be focused on maintaining the most lethal fighting force in the history of the world at this critical time, and third, have caused public perception of the military to crater over the last couple of years. These are objective facts. I want to focus on that third point because in November of last year, the Reagan Foundation conducted a survey of thousands of Americans that spanned the spectrum of demographic criteria. Just 5 years ago, everybody needs to understand this, 5 years ago, that same survey found that 70% of Americans had a great deal of trust and confidence in the military. But last year, that number plummeted to 48%. So we got to let that sink in. Less than half of the American public has a great deal of trust and confidence in our military. Secretary Austin, do you know what the top response was when the surveyors asked the people why their trust in the military has eroded?
I don't.
I want to enter that report into the record, if that's okay.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I'd commit it to your reading because 62% of the respondents in that nationwide poll said that military leadership has become overly politicized, and that has decreased their confidence. So we know that confidence in the military is eroded. We know that the top reason for that erosion is the military leadership is just too political, and that brings us to the decisions you've made. Last year, we talked about the COVID vaccine mandate, and we knew at that time that was going to lead to a recruiting shortfall. It already had. You reiterated here your unwillingness to repeal the policy, and thankfully we intervened in the NDAA to repeal it ourselves. But our lingering concern here is that the damage done by that mandate is still being realized. It's probably irreparable, and I think the Reagan Foundation survey is proving some evidence of that. But now, the issue of the day now is your next crusade, and it appears to be abortion policy. On February 23rd, dozens of members of this committee wrote to you asking very important information relating to the department's new abortion travel policy. Are you familiar with the letter we sent you and or the response that we received just last week, finally, from Undersecretary Cisneros?
I am familiar with the letter. Yes.
Well, did you see the response? Did you review it before it went out?
I've seen the response, yes.
It was a non-response. It answered none of our important questions, and the most important of which was the legal justification, because here again, you're not only causing division, you're exceeding your legal authority. Abortion travel policy that's here provides the basis for reimbursing service members for travel costs associated with obtaining an abortion, but the law is very clear. Law and the legislative intent behind it. Title 10, Section 1093 explicitly prohibits funds available to the DoD from being used in abortion services. I get that you're trying to find a crafty workaround, but it's a blatant violation of the intent behind the statute. Are you aware of the applicable statute here?
I tell you what I am aware of, and that is that this policy is based on sound legal basis. And if you go to the Department of Justice's public-facing website, you'll see what their opinion of this is as well. And again, I would emphasize that 1 in 5 of our troops are women. 80,000 of them now live in places where they don't have access to non-covered reproductive health care. So this is important to our force. I've heard from our force. I heard from our leaders, our senior enlisted leaders. I heard from our chiefs, our secretaries. This is something that's very important to the force.
What's more important is adherence to the rule of law, sir. And in our system, it is the United States Congress that makes those decisions, not you. This is a statute that was created by the people's elected representatives. And the last time I checked, not a single person in this country voted for you. You're not an elected official. You don't get to make this policy. And this insistence upon diving into issues outside of simply maintaining a lethal and capable fighting force is tearing our military apart.
This is the most combat credible force on the planet.
Then why is the trust of the American people eroded so much? Why do all these surveys over and over confirm what we know intuitively, that they don't trust the leadership of the military? You're diving into issues that you should not be involved in. There's a process in our constitutional system. We expect for you to respect that.
The
and
troops,
you're not when you
the
make
troops trust the re-enlistment rates are higher than they've ever been in 50 years.
Listen,
our troops like what they're doing. They like the fact that their leadership cares about them. and we're going to continue to care about
I
it.
have 15 seconds left. I'm going to ask you to repeal this unlawful policy. It will be challenged in court, I'm certain. You will certainly lose it. But save us all the hassle and follow the law. That's what I'm asking. I yield.